Hello and welcome to How Green Is Your Deal, a podcast about Europe's path to climate neutrality, the challenges it faces, and the ideas that guide it. I'm your host Jana Jöns, a climate policy researcher at Stockholm University, and this podcast is part of the GreenDeal-NET network and the EU Climatic Project. Today, we continue our series on democracy and climate change, produced in collaboration with the RETOOL project. So in the previous episodes, we explored already the broader relationship between addressing the democratic backsliding and encouraging more climate action. And we also took a closer look at citizen assemblies as a tool for more public participation and more legitimacy of climate legislation. In these episodes, we continue looking a little bit in this public participation topic, and we look specifically at how citizens and stakeholders can participate in what is called the national climate and energy plans of the member states. So to help us unpack this, I am not alone, but I am joined today by Lea Schewe, a researcher at the Brussels School of Governance, whose work focuses on democratic governance in Europe. Hi Lea, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me.
So maybe to begin, I mentioned that we are going to focus today on these national energy and climate plans. Can you explain to us what they are and how they work?
Yeah, so these plans are required from the European Union to member states, and member states develop in these plans the different policies and actions that they want to put into place to contribute to the European Union's climate targets. These plans are quite recent, so they have been put into place in 2018 through the governance regulations. And so the past NECPs have been outlining how member states want to contribute to the 2030 targets of the European Union. They have quite a difficult system in the way they function. So they have a 10 years horizon. But since it's quite difficult to plan policies across 10 years, there's also an update in between. So NECPs happen, there's an initial NECP for 10 years, and then in between, after 5 years, there's an update NECP. And within these two NECPs, the way they're created is that there's always a draft phase where a country would elaborate the plan and then submit it to the European Commission, who would review it to see whether it actually fits to the targets, general targets, or if it really contributes to the European Union's targets. And then it goes back to the member state and they finalize the plan and then they finally submit it. So we have in fact 4 different plans over the past years.
Yeah, so we have 10-year plans in 2 stages that then are all also in 2 stages,
exactly.
Split apart. And these plans, as you said, they really serve to outline the implementation of these climate emission reduction targets that the EU sets. And then the Commission, of course, then checks to see if the member states are actually doing enough to what they should be doing. So a little spoiler perhaps, but we are going to talk about public participation in the NECPs, already indicating that there is some public participation involved in the drafting of these plans at the different stages. How does that exactly work?
So in these NECPs, member states need to conduct public consultation at each of these 4 stages, or 2 stages within one cycle.
Yes,
so
complicated.
And there are quite stringent requirements that are both coming from European law and international law on public participation in environmental matters. Public participation in that sense is quite important because it's a way to engage more and better the public. So public considered at very large citizens, stakeholders, NGOs, business associations, and to include them more in decisions that affect them. And research and practice has shown that actually you increase a lot the quality of the decisions, the legitimacy of the decisions, if you use this public participation process. So coming back to the NECPs, it's very nice that, it means that on climate policy planning across Europe, these public consultations serve this aim to include more citizens and the public at large in elaborating climate policy at large.
Yeah, so from that point, it's quite important, right, that you have these diverse voices also in the planning of these instruments, not only to make them better, but also to perhaps increase their acceptance, especially if it's like these 10-year plans. Ideally, you would have some support from the public in what they're trying to do. Of course, public participation, it sounds quite nice, but can you say a little bit more on if they are actually as implemented as they should, and if they can reach these results, or if they can reach the goals that they're actually put in place to reach?
Yeah. Concretely, the image that we have from these, how well the consultation have been put into place across Europe is quite varied, quite mixed. But first of all, maybe what are the elements on which you would want to assess public consultation? There are at least 4 major criteria. So the first one is on inclusiveness. Does this participation process include all the affected people? Is it diverse enough? Is it accessible? Another aspect would be more on the quality of the deliberation. Do we have enough time? Do we have enough information for citizens, the public in general, to contribute to it meaningfully? Then the third aspect would be on policy impact. Is the decisions that are formulated in these consultations actually taken up by the governments and serve to create better policies? And then the fourth aspect would be transparency. So to what extent are these consultations clear about who participates, what is discussed, when they take place, how they take place? So across these 4 dimensions, you will have, or there are some countries that are constantly quite good at putting them into place. We have Slovenia, Latvia, and France. So they score quite high across the 4 years that we've observed until now. And then you have countries that are quite regularly laggards, we would say, and these are more like Slovakia, Bulgaria, and Poland. So I'm saying that they're laggards because either they implemented constantly very low quality public participation, or they have not really done consultations in the first place. So that's a bit problematic. And then you would also have countries that do very good public participation in some years and then either don't do some, like Germany, or do very low quality ones. So that's kind of the specificities, but overall, over the 4 years, we see a slight increase in the quality. But you would also kind of think that, so the quality is getting better, but we still have a lot of countries that don't do public consultation. So in 2024, we would have around 7 countries that didn't do consultations, which is quite a lot over 27.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's variation between these member states and both over time, and although it's quite optimistic that it's getting a little bit better at least, or that member states are also learning from how they've done it before and maybe also seeing what others are doing, there is some improvements. But said that it either then also becomes a box ticking for other member states, or even just something that they do not even want to tick the box of, but just kind of disregards. Do you have any explanations of why there is this variation between the member states and over time?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the critical question.
Yeah.
It's still part of the research I'm doing, and so I don't have a specific answer. I think it's a mix of different factors and they still need to be tested. But yeah, the first one is probably around the prioritization of climate change on the political agenda, because that plays a lot of, it builds some pressure up to make this consultation and advance on this topic. Then there's probably also the aspect of leadership, both at the national level, because you will have some leaders that want to have this as an important part of their external policy or internal policy, and also leadership at the more granular level of ministries or authorities that are conducting these public consultation and that want to put the emphasis on the democratic part of it. Another aspect would probably be related more to resources and skills, because public putting into place public participation is expensive or has a cost, both on the human side and on the money side, I'd say. So you need a bit of resources to put that into place, and in particular between draft and final, it requires to put in place consultations 1 year over the other. So it's not always possible in the countries. And then one thing that may facilitate it is if countries already have consultation systems in place, then they could just use the existing systems to make the consultations on the NECPs. And a final point is more the relation of a country to the European Union. So first how long has it been part of the European Union as a member state? Because you could think that a member state that has been part of the European Union for a long time is kind of used to the mechanisms and has a bit more knowledge on how to implement these consultations that are coming from a supranational authority. And on the other hand, the attitudes of countries towards the European Union is also likely to influence this, because you may have countries that kind of embrace this requirement and others that kind of reject it and therefore do also the bare minimum. So the quality of public consultation is probably linked a lot to context, but we still need to find this out more precisely.
Yeah, but it does, to me it makes sense that it's a combination of this mix of things. Like if there's political will to actually do this public participation, and also on climate, right, take climate policy and work in this way with citizens and stakeholders and include them. But then even if they want to do it, they still have to have the resources to do it. And as you said, like these NECPs, there's so many cycles and drafts, like that alone requires a lot of work for these member states. And then if they want to do a really high quality public participation in all these steps, like that requires like a lot of resources and time from the administration to put in a bit turbulent times, of course, as well. And then, yeah, unfortunately, we also have more and more Eurosceptic countries that maybe also do not want to do this like at all, or feel some way. So I'm really curious to see what you will find in how all these things work together. I'm sure we'll have to do another episode to discuss it more. So maybe more of like a general question related to this. As I've now said, there's lots of turbulence happening at the moment. Lots of democratic backsliding also in the EU, lots of things around better regulation and simplification, as I like to call it. Some of these things also really put this democratic governance things at risk, right? Like especially when we're talking about public participation, precisely for this resources reason. From your perspective, what could be done to still sort of safeguard these important, good democratic governance practices?
It's a very wide question.
Yes. Tell me what you think about democracy in the EU and how we should solve it.
Yeah, perhaps there are two things that I could think of for now. The first one is on the narrative side. So we've seen a lot, this idea that because at the moment we are in turbulent times, we need to take faster decisions. We need to also reduce costs, like these things, which are certainly true to some extent. But this means, or this is often used as an excuse to then overrule some public participation mechanism, because they do cost money and they do cost time, which to a certain extent is true that they cost more time and that they cost more time and money than if you don't do them, that's for sure. But actually they also serve a purpose. And this narrative about why they're actually useful is at the moment in the public debate quite is fading away. But public participation is important if we want to have higher quality decisions at the end, if we want these decisions to be more legitimate. It's also important in the implementation phase afterwards. Once you have the decisions and you need to implement them, you're likely to have less contestation around this. So in the end, it may cost a bit, it may be time and money consuming in the beginning, but I think it also accelerates the process towards the end. So if you kind of scrape them away, you're likely not improving fast, or you're not reaching faster policy making through it. So I think there's a narrative here to be put back into the forefront to then say, well, why is democratic governance important? And this would contribute to safeguard it. And the second aspect in terms of concrete action would be more on the transparency aspect. I think we need to keep processes as transparent as possible about what's discussed, who is invited, how does the process work. So where transparency exists, keep it as much as possible and introduce transparency in other processes that are quite opaque, because this increases accountability. It also increases the scrutiny that the public can have on these processes. And this is kind of the base for good democratic governance, I think.
Yeah, I think those are two excellent points, and I also so much agree with this from my own research about the necessity to go slow, to go fast, and having this long-term perspective on the entire policy-making process, and not just on what the things are happening right now. And then, of course, without transparency, how can there be accountability? It's such a good point to make there as well. Related to this, as I said, we are a bit in turbulent times. You also said turbulent times. There's turbulence coming at us from all different angles and approaches. Every day there seems to be more turbulence coming from somewhere as well. Within all of this perhaps more challenging context, is there something that still gives you hope for the future?
So I used to have a lot of hope in kind of big commitments like the Paris Agreement, big plans like the European Green Deal, this planification. I think it helps a lot into kind of building a path towards the future. And this still works to a certain extent. I've lost a bit more hope in current times where these politics around climate change are a bit difficult. But another aspect that I think gives me a lot of energy and therefore also hope is to see that climate change and climate action has infused a lot in society. It becomes much more linked to other topics, social justice, new economic models, new agricultural practices. So it's linked to other topics. So in a sense, it becomes much more democratic because climate action becomes more rooted in people's practice in everyday life. So in that sense, I think that's super. It's more of a small scale difference, but it gives a lot of energy because you see the practices. And in that sense, I'd say climate change is less loud than before, where you would have these big agreements, these big demonstrations and so on, but it's still very present in everyday life, very visible, and that's very important.
Mm-hmm. The groundwork is there.
Yes.
And at least, even if our policymakers are doing, let's say, weird things at the moment, at least from the ground, there is still a lot of attention to it, and people are making the changes that will bring us to a more climate resilient future as well. All right, thanks a lot, Lea. It was great to have you on.
Thank you very much, Jana. This is super nice.
That's it for this episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to How Green Is Your Deal on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you are listening. If you want to stay informed on GreenDeal-NET's activities, please go to greendeal-net.eu and subscribe to the newsletter.